Welcome, everyone, on this very exciting and special occasion. My name is Chris Washburn. I'm the chair of the music department, and I have the honor of moderating and also introducing the panelists this evening. It's so wonderful to see some familiar faces that I haven't seen for a while, and all together in person is wonderful. So I'm going to introduce the illustrious panel in the reverse order of their appearance. Professor Brinkley Messick, sitting down at the end of the table, is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at Columbia University. Writing and reading, considered as cultural and historical phenomena, have figured centrally in his research on Islamic societies in both Arabia and North Africa. Alessandra introduced him to me as saying, he's the one who really knows. This work considers the production and circulation, inscription, and subsequent interpretation of Arabic texts, such as regional histories, law books, and court records. His two current projects are on Sharia litigation, focusing on doctrine and court records, and questions of truth and method, and evidence and interpretation, and on agrarian Sharia, concerning the relations of landed property, trade, state, and family. Sitting next to him is Professor Kevin Fellez, who is Associate Professor in the Music and the African American and African Diasporic Studies departments at Columbia University. He is also the newly appointed Director for the Center for Jazz Studies. He works on a variety of popular musics and has been published in numerous journals and anthologies. His books include the Woody Guthrie Book Award-winning Birds of Fire, Jazz, Rock, Funk, and the Creation of Fusion on Duke University Press, and it's a study of 1970s fusion music, and also a book that was celebrated in this forum a couple years ago during the pandemic, Listen But Don't Ask Questions, Hawaiian slack key guitar across the Trans-Pacific, also on Duke University Press, a study of the Hawaiian slack key guitar and its articulation of Hawaiian values in Hawaii, California, and Japan. Sitting next to Professor Fellez is Professor Virginia Danielson, probably the hippest librarian that I've ever met, and is an associate of the Harvard Music Department and a visiting scholar at NYU Abu Dhabi. Previously, she served as the Director of Libraries at NYU Abu Dhabi and as Richard F. French Librarian of the Loeb Music Library at Harvard University and the Curator of the university's Archive of World Music. She taught occasionally in Harvard's Music Department and an ethnomusicologist by training. Danielson is the author of an award-winning monograph, The Voice of Egypt in Kuthum, Arabic Song, Egyptian Society in the 20th Century, and co-editor of The Middle East, Volume 6 of the Garland Encyclopedia of World Music. Professor Danielson is also a co-editor of the book Music and Arabia, Indiana University Press. And the rock star of the hour, my favorite colleague in the music department, Professor Alessandra Ciucci received a PhD in music, ethnomusicology from the City University of New York at the Graduate Center. Her research interests include the music of Morocco, the Maghreb, the Mediterranean, gender and sexuality, sung poetry, popular music of the Arab world, and music and migration. Her first book, The Voice of the Rural, University of Chicago Press, explores the significance and the endurance of the specific notion of the rural in music, poetry, and the voice among migrant Moroccan men in the Umbria region of Italy. She's Associate Professor of Music at Columbia University and currently on leave as a fellow of the Institute at the Institute for Ideas and Imagination in Paris. And it's so wonderful that she's come back for some conferences. It's nice to see you back. And also to celebrate her recent publication. So without further ado, Alessandra.
Thank you, Chris. Thank everybody to be here. And it warms my heart to see all these faces, and I thank you. And I'm in the center. Before I begin to talk, can we play a bit of music? My lord, the domes of the celebrated shrines, Al-Ghlimi, my lord Hamad, the benevolence of Benabat, the owner of the banner bearers, the one with the heartfelt greetings, Mulay Abdullah bin Hussein, Ratnani, my lord Hussein, whose site is where the river meets. Have mercy, have mercy, have mercy. The Abadi tribe manages you and also your parents. It is with this voice and these poetic fragments layered with history, allusion, and local knowledge that my research on the voice of the rural began. At the time of this field recording, I was in Morocco to conduct my doctoral research on the complex relationship between a class of professional female singer dancers known as shikhat and a genre of sung poetry thought to be able to recreate a sensorial and emotional experience of place. The quality of a voice described as harsh, rough, or coarse had caught my attention. And in the effort to better understand its aesthetics, I began to notice how listeners and performers thought of this voice as the medium which allowed them to smell and taste a particular notion of the rural, that is, la arubiya. The voice of the rural, or sot la arubiya, allowed me then to explore how Moroccans from the central plains and plateaus conceive of the voice as a sonic phenomenon in which they perceive timbre as central because it acoustically embodies nature, the environment, and the experiences of space, time, and memory. Decades later, in Italy, the same experience of the rural reemerged with unforeseen intensity in the compelling tropes used by the Moroccan men I met in Umbria. What this book explores, therefore, is the significance and endurance of La Arubiyan music, poetry, and the voice in the context of migration, and more in particular, among migrant Moroccan men in Umbria, but also beyond. I posit that my interlocutors are able to recover a personhood rooted in a notion of what it means to be a real man, a rajul, that is problematically perceived and ultimately denied in Italy through the voice of the rural. I investigate how this voice is a means for this migrant to reclaim a way of being in the world, claim a space in contemporary Italy, and in doing so, turn their ears away from an integrationist rhetoric that rejects their difference. I explore the significance of La Arubiya in two interrelated traditional musico-poetic genres, Aita and Abidat Rama, and their contemporary renditions categorized as shabby. I ask how and why the music, the poetry, and the voice of the rural matter when we examine the experience of these laborers, migrant men reduced to working bodies whose intimate lives have been shamed, silenced, ignored, or worse, fetishized through troubling discourses on sexuality. And attend to how the notion of La Arubiya is voiced, performed, listened to, understood, and experienced in reference to these genres. The voice of the rural is about the resilience of creativity and imagination among migrant Moroccan men, shameful figures, peasants marginal to the nation whose lands were rendered unusable and then taken away, men who were forced to migrate first internally and then transnationally, migrants who have drowned at sea and who continue to drown on land, the ready-to-use labor force that Europe is as quick to attract as to erase and expel, the seasonal migrant and the undocumented, agricultural laborers and skilled workers, mason, water weller, driller, itinerant vendors, and those who simply get by. Migrants who are perceived with profound hostility as they incarnate an historical trauma, who are criminalized rather than embraced, and whose utterances are ignored. It is in this context that the voice of the rural becomes the privileged medium through which migrant Moroccan men are able to preserve their rural ethos by drawing from the past, the heroic, the erotic, and the familiar, and in experiencing wholeness to respond to their invisibility and non-existence. Listening to the voice of the rural becomes a political act, an act through which is possible to express concerns and perspectives across history and borders in order to assert human dignity, perform a masculinity that needs to be acknowledged by others and that allows to reconstruct oneself as a worthy individual. Unlike other books on music and migration, this book is not about migrant musicians. For these laborers are not performers, nor they're able to experience the voice of the rural in traditional performance contexts in Italy. And yet, I argue, if one listens attentively, the voice of the rural is ubiquitous in their everyday life. We're from La Arubiya, even if we no longer reside there. There is nothing for us in cities and nothing for us here. Al-Kabir, a former tailor from Khoribga who has been working in the tobacco fields since the late 1990s, comments. Everything is in La Arubiya. Ahmed is quick to comment. Al-Kabir, whose large jovial face is marked by bushy eyebrows, continues. What I miss listening to the cry of the cock early in the morning. The voice of women and children taking the sheep to the pasture. Sh, sh, here, here. Al-Kabir utters as he imitates the voice made by women and children. I love cows too, the little Sufyan comments, trying to get my attention by lightly tapping my arms. Hush, hush, Ali gently tells his grandson. But they're beautiful, Sufyan timidly continues.
I would also like to thank the center and especially Lindsay for providing so much help for this invitation to comment on Professor Ciucci's book. It's my honor to be here. I'll begin by stating what will be obvious to those of you who have read the book. Ciucci's research is at once deep and extensive, born of years of experience in Morocco, not to say Italy, with rich and colorful ethnographic reflections, her analysis meticulous, her command of related literature impressive. Her writing is at once informative, analytical, and often poetic itself. Intellectually, the book brings forward a number of themes, as you've just heard. Migration, here largely of male workers. Masculinity, the importance of poetry, vernacular and literary. Meanings of listening, the rural and place, and Arab music. In the time I have today, I'd like to focus on this last one, hoping to situate this book in the domain of Arab music scholarship. While Ciucci's work is characterized by detailed ethnography based on long experience with the Moroccan community in the Atlantic Plains and in Umbria, Italy, the book should not be understood only as a close reading of a limited community. Rather, it develops sound concepts that resonate over centuries and across Arab communities in the Middle East, those are the value of the voice, salt, and sung or chanted poetry. Ciucci makes this point in her introduction. I would like to emphasize it here, starting with poetry. Great poets, to name a few from the 20th century, Adonis, Ahmed Shawki, Nizar Qabbani, Bedo Matunsi, wrote poems specifically to be sung and encouraged the singing of poetry, of new poetry. The chronicles of early Arab courts describe the gifts of singers of poetry much more frequently than of instrumentalists. Nabati, or vernacular poetry, constitutes important heritage throughout the Arabian Peninsula. Chanted poetry has served there to settle or mediate disputes. Song is usually valued for cleverness, humor, and direct impact of a poem created by the potential for multiple meanings. Ibrahim Nagy's line, Atini Khoriyati, Itlaq Yadayan, give me my freedom, set free my hands, was at once a love poem and a political demand voiced over decades in the late 20th century in the face of several different conflicts. Telat Yamachla Nurha yields meanings, the sun rose, what a beautiful light, or she came outside, how beautiful is her light. Male singers draw attention to their local origins and to poetic meaning. Yusuf Omar's Iraqi maqam performances, Kulthum's favorite singer, Muhammad Kandil, to name two, using historic qualities of voice, hoarseness, strength, long phrases described in Ciucci's book. Beyond the internationally available world of Arab pop described by Daniel Gilman a few years ago, there have been lively recording markets, certainly during the cassette era, of regional singers from towns and surrounding villages whose songs evoke their own places using vocal tones and lyrics similarly in general terms to what Ciucci describes. Now, I'm not trying to argue that these things sound exactly alike, but they work with the same concepts: tone, color, south, particular aspects of tone, color, south, and clever poetry, meaningful poetry. Ciucci presents workers as listening, appreciating, finding important meaning in songs, giving them a way to live as migrants. Her points on voice and poetry resonate in every Arab community I've ever lived in. Weaving together, she writes, the fragments of a sense of place, the natural world, history, beauty, and desire to connect with an emotional topography to multiple registers of masculinity. Which brings us to the sound qualities of masculinity. The sound of the voice, excuse me, she describes matters greatly in defining ways. Having lived in a southern Egyptian community populated with rural workers, among others, the particular voice of Ciucci's rural is very familiar to me only in Egyptian rather than Moroccan dialect. The real man emerges in song and speech in Ciucci's book, and that is also widely familiar, often rural and more common in the working class than among elites or merchants. In Egypt, one finds the concept, the heritage, and the voice among Abna el-Balad, sons of the country. Huwa rajul wa gada. He's a real man and strong. Kulthum described Kandil, born in Cairo and regarded as an Ibn Balad, or a real son of the country, as a rajul, and gada, defined in the Hans Badawi Dictionary of Egyptian Colloquial Arabic as one possessed of nobility of character and integrity, intelligence and application to the task at hand, and having manly toughness and courage. The roughness, the volume, the often stentorian tone of male speech in the communities of peasants or settled Bedouin produces an identifiable local identity, a local authority that is sometimes or often mocked by city folk. We in North America, those of us with exposure to Arab music, understand South and sung poetry much less well than we do melodic modes, rhythmic patterns, and instruments. Indeed, South and sung poetry are hard to teach and take time to explain relative to a music theory that involves tones and rhythms. Ciucci gives us, with her transliterated and translated song text, her analyses and musical examples, a way to understand difficult arts that are bedrock to Arab music, Arab heritage. The book has no glossary, thus requiring us to come to terms, literally, with the complexities of the concepts and the expressions discussed. There is no shortcut. In such a voice, Ciucci writes, my interlocutors can listen, smell, and taste a great gamut of herbs and spices, accompanying the historical, but also imaginary, heroic expedition across the Atlantic plains and plateaus all the way into Italy. South and sung poetry have provided this potential in the Arab world for centuries. Ciucci gives us a great way to hear and understand it ourselves.
I too want to thank Alessandra for inviting me onto this illustrious panel, and it's Quite an honor to be here this evening. Alessandra has given us a wonderfully textured study of migrant Moroccan men in Umbria, Italy, who use music and poetry to engender a sense of connection between the rurality termed arubiya they left behind and the rurality they confront and co-create in their new surroundings. In the limited time I have here, and because I'm currently thinking about interspecies relationships for my own work, I'd like to focus on the ways in which non-human animals, a designation I use to remind us of our own status as animals, play important roles in constituting l'arubiya. Present in the imagined transnational arubiya, these working class male migrants sing and speak into being. These shadows whose utterances are ignored, as Alessandra so eloquently describes them, are their deep relationships with non-human animals, the sentient others of l'arubiya. Through a rich ethnographic ear, we hear these men and their non-human animal companions and sound l'arubiya in ways that complement and complicate the more conventionally semantic and linguistic articulations found in their poetry and song. An effective, if often simultaneous, utilitarian relationship between human and non-human animals resonates within the transnational l'arubiya these men construct, with an authoritative rooting in Moroccan soil, given expression in the cobblestoned and paved streets of the small towns of provincial Italy, distant yet still reverberant. Tracking the sounds and sentiments afforded the non-human animals and the relationships, the structures of feeling that are constructed, invoked, and performed through these non-human soundings articulates this trans-species relationship. The relationship between human and non-human is expressed through vocalizations, which are sung, imitated, or spoken about. Their sound ideal embraces non-human animals as soundings, assisting these men in both articulating, for example, the aesthetic reasons undergirding a particular vocal gesture, as well as the ways in which non-human animals engender effective responses. Most importantly, it is the ways in which non-human animals move and sound, which enables and enhances the men's excess of l'arubiya, whether they are in Morocco or Italy. For example, in describing what Mustafa meant when he exclaimed, "The cry of my country cannot be forgotten," Alessandra points out that Mustafa, quote, articulated his emotions through sound, or more specifically, through the term zay. That is, a high-pitched cry associated with such animals as mice, hedgehogs, rabbits, and baby birds, end quote. The chapter Longing, Intimacy, and Belonging begins with a group of Moroccan men discussing the horses and donkeys they have left behind, expressing a sensitivity and tenderness, along with a lot of good-natured teasing of one of the men who becomes particularly distraught in telling a story about one of his family's donkeys, that illuminates the close relationship these men have with the non-human invertebrates of l'arubiya. I don't think I'm misinterpreting things here to say that for these men, the non-human animals they left behind in Morocco are more than pets or beasts of burden. In fact, it is other humans who often prove more alienating. In a discussion regarding the ill-tempered dogs of their villages, one of the men, replying to a question of whether or not the dogs are affected by rabies, jokes, "In our region, humans have rabies." He isn't nearly worried about his neighbor's snarling dog as much as the taxi driver who wields a bat in order to win an argument. Accordingly, these non-human animals can become models for the humans in their midst. The Moroccan men speak of dancing like horses and snakes, of mimicking the cry of dogs and wild boars. This relationship between men and beasts can also signal cultural loss, as when Alessandra writes of an elderly Bedouin distraught that his 20-year-old son is, quote, never seen a camel, and whose small children thought it was the same creature as the cow they saw in their European-influenced picture books, end quote. Alessandra tells us early in the book that there's a popular idiom regarding the rurality of the Moroccan immigrant that assembles the human, the non-human animal, and the non-human artifact together, quote, from the donkey to the airplane, end quote. This triangular relationship is expressed through poetry and music, but I was struck by the foundational place of the non-human animal in the formation of l'arubiya. As Alessandra later points out, quoting Ana Maria Ochoa, the practice of imitating or referring to the sounds of animals is the sonic dimension of the everyday. Alessandra raises two other important points, the second of which I will stay with for the remainder of my remarks. The first is the common observation that both humans and non-human animals share the capacity for a voice. The second point is that, quote, although animals figure significantly in Islamic thought and culture, zoology, understood in the narrow and contemporary sense of the word, was not as developed because animals were always regarded in relation to humankind, end quote. I was particularly intrigued by this description of interspecial relationships that resonates with indigenous groups' ideas regarding the emplacement of the human in a larger shared biosphere of reciprocal obligations and privileges. Alessandra cogently analyzes the ways in which masculinity is shaped by la arubiya, and I was struck by the ways in which animals are constantly butting in. The kestrel is a dancer, the donkey is a friend, and it is obvious throughout the text that, quote, la arubiya can emerge through the detailed description of a particular breed of sheep and beautiful horses, end quote. This close, even intimate relationship with non-human animals are not coded through an anthropomorphization, as we often see in consumer cultures, predilection for turning mammals in particular into cutified plush toys or cartoon figures. These are men who are in contact with real animals, not stuffed toys. And it is this knowing relationship that permeates the conversations, the lyrics, and the poetry of these men. One of Alessandra's interlocutors, El Kabir, pronouncing that correctly, reveals, quote, "What do I miss about Morocco?" I think I'm quoting the same line. "I miss hearing the cry of the rooster early in the morning, the voices of women and children taking the sheep to the pastures," end quote. Another interlocutor, Sufyan, interjects, "I love cows too, they are beautiful," expressing the affection for and perception of the non-human animals by these men, connecting their sense of masculinity to other sentiences, other ways of being in the world. That in fact, la arubiya is not simply a human space, but a shared interspecial space with human and non-human animals interacting, and pointedly in the voice of the rural, sounding out or voicing a shared rurality inherent to those relationships and interactions, inspiring song, dance, and poetry. I will conclude my remarks with an example drawn from the opening of the first chapter that I think encapsulates this human to non-human animal relationship. Hassan's longing for la arubiya, quote, turns to the animal world. "When I go back home to the countryside, I go back to the fields and to the animals I love. Sheep, goats. Do you know that I used to be in love with a donkey when I was little? I was so happy to ride that donkey. It was as if I were riding a Ferrari," end quote. Hassan invokes la arubiya through the animals he loves, anchored by a sense of placement within a shared cosmology filled with sheep, goats, donkeys, and camels, as well as snakes, hawks, dogs, and horses. Hassan and his fellow migrants do not comprehend la arubiya as a rurality empty of the non-human. Through Alessandra's beautifully written text, we hear these shadows whose utterances are ignored, voicing and sounding the rural as a deeply shared space of human and non-human animal interaction through the poetics of la arubiya.
Thank you. Thank you also to the Hyman Center and Alessandra. So I would like to take you to the last page very quickly, where there's a quote that says, "As soon as you hear it, you start dancing all by yourself." This is about music. And I thought, that's just like Motown for me. And but also I feel this way about Moroccan music as well. You know, I have 45s that Alessandra's got now. So this is about a particular migration. It's a long history of the Mediterranean and people's moving back and forth, et cetera. But her focus is on the 21st century, early 21st century. And you have on the one hand, the plains of sort of near Casablanca on the coast into where the mountains begin to go up in a place like Khanifra, which was close to where I lived. It was it has markets and things like that. So this is all very beautiful, but very empty in a certain kind of way, at least originally. And so Sandra calls it the Atlantic Plains, which is okay. But it's a lot of territory, and it has that town of Khoribga, which has all sort of commercial things and production of phosphates, et cetera. And that's on one side of it. And then the other side, of course, is Umbria. And you have two amazingly interesting, different places that this migration is going to be back and forth in lots of times. People going and not staying, or people going and staying and coming back. And so, and the arubiya is characterized as the countryside, but there's also the mountains too, and that kind of thing. So, and one of the things that fascinated me was in this book about music is that the historical contexts that are given to you as a reader on two contexts, basically the French colonial context, which is very fascinating. We got even into the details of people who had French scholars who had studied music. Prosper Ricard, yes, who I knew because he's written 3 books of 3 volumes on weavings. And speaking of animals, I'm hoping to give I'm giving a weaving seminar next semester. And it has a lot of Moroccan textiles and rugs, and it's about goats and sheep. But this music story here it too has been studied by the French colonialists. And also people were mapping the territory. What used to not be private property used to be places where tribal groups could move in transhumance kind of thing, not Bedouin. And she takes us back even to Ibn Khaldun and how Ibn Khaldun was picked up by the scholars. And so this is it's a lot there actually. It's a lot more than you would expect in an ethnography of music. And because again, there is scholarship. There's a lot of scholarship that Alessandra had to deal with by the French for these kinds of genres. But that's only one side of it. The other side is the history, the recent history in Italy. And I was living in Italy myself, and I had some relatives there. And I used to hear about how evil the Moroccans were. And this is after I had been in Morocco, and I didn't have any idea what that was all about. And this was fleshed out a bit, so to speak, in after World War II. These were French armies, and which was a lot of Moroccan not volunteers, but a lot of Moroccans in it. So you get 2 bits of history that if not complete, at least it shows you have to think about that kind of thing in order to realize what the migration is all about, and to realize something about maybe some of the thinking going on in the songs or the poetry. Alessandra's ethnography starts in 2000 in Morocco with women, and then in 2015 in Italy with men. And this is really an interesting dichotomy, shall we say. But this is the field work she was doing. And the field work actually ends up in even places like a correctional facility in Rome, just to said in passing. I mean, so this is and we have a picture of Alessandra in a cafe on page 120. Sort of Messina a little bit there in the cafe with all these boys. Anyway, so but here's I think the most important thing, I think, for me as an anthropologist is her focus on how people think of their own practices, how they express them. So you have, and she speaks about ideologies of the voice, the sot, that there's conceptualization there that the anthropologist, the external social scientist, doesn't just bring concepts and that becomes the way that the thing is talked about. So she also has the metaphor of the burning, the haraga. This is about the migration itself over the water, the danger of it. But she's looking at their metaphors. That's the way. And then about the rajul, the real man, same thing. It's about you take the concept, you listen, you find it out in discussions and interviews, and you realize that it's a key term, and you look into it, you explicate it with them, and you ask them questions about it. And so, and the thing about the voice, the harsh, all these things, the technical terms, and then there are all these, as she calls them, self-narrations of migration. This is the real story in the sense that the long text of the ethnographic accounts that come out in italics is really about these experiences people have had. And she's gone to people both in Italy and in Morocco, and has drawn from them, was able to be with them and was able to hear from them their own narrations of what migration was like and what the music is like and what counts as a good poem. All these kind of things. This is just classic and really, really excellent ethnography. She has transcriptions, transliterations, and translations, all the transes going on. And I was sort of curious about how, because there was some, I know some of the dictionaries for colloquial Moroccan Arabic, which are not too great, but I think you developed your own set of transcriptions. And am I past my 8 minutes or? Well, I just wanted to say, I had the thing I was thinking about is something that people say in Morocco, but if they really appreciate somebody or find that person really unbelievably excellent, they say, "Shkun b'halek," who's like you? So thank you.
Thank you for all these rich comments and more. I'm just going to try to go through a couple of things that have been discussed, beginning with the idea of developing voice, salt, rather than melody, makam, and everything that we maybe find more commonly when discussing Arab music. I think in many ways, one of the reason why I really specifically try to develop a sensibility to the voice is because these migrants are not musicians. And what they constantly refer was about that voice. So in many ways, that was the only way I could go about it, to the point that sometimes they were not always ready to talk about music. They have other problems to deal with. And so it's often was a way to how does that sound come out from a certain conversation. They have tapes, they listen to music and so forth, but they're always constantly refer to the voice. And they're very particular. That's the voice of that region. And you're right. The Atlantic Plains is quite large because effectively one should go Shawiya, Abdali, and so forth. And it's maybe my, I don't know. Anyway, they are able to distinguish an accent. They're able to distinguish a sound and so forth. So that clearly, and sometimes they would even imitate. The one thing that they were all very adamant about it is that the urban sound just doesn't do it, both linguistically, but just a sound. And even the kamanja, the viola, that one would think, well, there's no difference between the city and the countryside. Oh, no. They would describe it, the viola of the city is cold. The rhythms are cold. The one from the countryside is the one that makes you dance, is the one that gives you. And in fact, if you looked at the kamanja, they usually had a much longer bowl, a lot of raisins, and there was something there that also was not clean. So it sound salt the voice rather than everything else that we may be more used to read when we read about Arab music. For me, was the only way I could do it. There was basically no other ways.
But it was important.
I'm glad you think so. Well, there's a long history of writing, yours, and centuries of treaties and much more, in which, in fact, it is about that sound and that voice, and always very important. So, Kevin, I think the essence, indeed, of being an Arubi, someone from the countryside, is to really have that strong relationship with what you call the non-human animals. Now, that was a bit of a difficult decision for me at times, because I didn't want them to seem like the animals. They're not civilized. To reduce them to because they already are not considered to be sophisticated. It's a population that it's often because the way they speak, because the way they may be acting, even because the way they eat and so forth, they might not, they're treated as second-class citizens. So that particular intimacy, I was extremely careful not to overdo it, because I was always afraid that, oh, here we go. So we're presenting someone who is not civilized and so forth. But I think, absolutely, that relationship, it just was never too far. There was something about it. Their memories of a particular animals, and then it was also interesting the way in which the donkey became a Ferrari. Right? That so I mean, they were not, or in the way in which they made it contemporary. It's not just. I mean, I think another struggle in the book, if you will, was not to have them look nostalgic. To have them look, this is still here. This is still here. This is still in what they experience every day, and that's very, very much part of the. I mean, actually, they said we don't have time to be nostalgic. We don't even know because we don't have time. So that was a good thing, because I could just get away with it immediately. But that was indeed something that I tried to work on it quite a bit because of the danger that it actually provoked. And frankly, again, to understand why such a scorn for the arubiya and the arubi, I had to go back to older text, particularly because in Chotin, Picard, and everybody, Prosper Ricard, and everything was seen. The Aïta in particular, the Abidat Ramat doesn't even exist, but the Aïta does. And every time they describe, the Aïta is what you actually heard at the beginning. Sung mostly by women, but also by men who sound like women. Nowadays, it has gotten a bit different, but there you have that aesthetic. And because there were women singing, you always have the sexual and the musical. And so they will often say, particularly the Chotin and more than one, and Prosper Ricard, it's their ornamentation, it's but their face, they're disguising something that we don't trust, and we don't know. So you have the Oriental tropes that they're always connected to the music. And so it was important for me to go back to, okay, so where some of the things came and how can I explain it? Because and then the Marochinate was a necessity. The Marochinate, the wars, the crime that they were committed, but in a very difficult moment, but also under very difficult circumstances in which, I mean, the fact that these crimes were given the name Marochinate, and in Italy you will say Marocchini. So although the legions were Algerian, Tunisian, Moroccans, and from Senegal, it was the empire. But the fact that was that. So it was impossible for me not to bring that into the discussion if I actually wanted to understand what it was like to be a Moroccan man, and and women were never excluded in many ways, but women's migration is quite different, and it would require also a number of other things. And yes, I try to listen to them. I always think that that's kind of ethnography. I mean, otherwise, why we go and stay and trying to capture. So, thank you.
Thank you all for that close reading and those wonderful comments. Now we open it up for any questions that anybody here has or comments. And so the folks online can hear, you'll have to speak into the microphone.
Hi, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you.
I don't think this was mentioned in the talk, but I remember at some point in the book, you talked about the distinction between the word immigrant and emigrant, and how immigrant is not as colloquially used as the word immigrant. And I was wondering if this also reflects on how the migrants themselves describe themselves.
What you're referring is actually something that I quote, in which in that case, he does use the term immigrant, but in many ways, that kind of distinction between immigrant and emigrant is only done in certain texts. Otherwise, they always would say migranti. So, but I understand, because at one point or another, there was there was that distinction and so forth. I think what distinction is important perhaps to retain, that I retain it in making one word, is the fact that it was Sayed that said, we have to know where the migrant come from, because we cannot always think of them as the ones who've settled. It's about their history before the settling. And then eventually where that immigrant is giving them a place where they came, rather than just a place where they arrive, which, and that was one of the reasons why I went into a certain historical view of them, because the understanding of when you come from then allows you to understand eventually the trajectory in the country, in the host country, if that answers. Okay.
I was just curious if you had readers within the community that you studied that sort of checked your work for authenticity and for voice and for kind of expressing their attitudes.
Yeah. So I worked very closely with the head of a union with whom I met everyone, and other people within the community. Now, there's a problem that most of the people of the community are not literate. So there's a problematic with that. However, the people that I've worked more closely, everything was triple checked, which doesn't mean that I'm exempted from having said something that is not wrong and so forth, but it was not only people in the community that read me, but also people in Morocco, because the idea is this continuum. So the work began really when I didn't even know that the work would have begun. And the reason how I could get into the community is because I was doing field work already in Morocco at the time. And in Morocco, I'm lucky to know from intellectuals to public intellectuals and scholars and so forth, as well as people who write. And then by the time I went to Italy, the people with whom I was more closely connected, and it was a constant back and forth. I say that I guess in my acknowledgements that it feels like if you ever look at a carpet, and if you know carpets, you never look at the front of the carpet, you look always at the back, because that's where the nodes are. That's where the weaving, and this book is like a carpet, because I wrote it, but in reality, the carpet is full of everybody else's voice, which hopefully have been treated accordingly. But thank you for the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Alessandra. I wanted to ask about communities of Moroccans who live in isolation within other regions of Italy. I'm thinking of my own hometown, which is, of course, it's an Arboresh town founded by Albanians in the 15th century, and which is very depopulated, but where we have a very small Moroccan community. There are about 40 people there. I was just there this summer for the first time since COVID. And what was interesting to me was to hear, 40 people is not very many, but the significant impact that this community is having on the local situation, because there is an elementary school which probably would have been closed, I'm told, were it not for these Arab children, for these Moroccan children. But and I could see them working, in my family's houses and so on. But the sounds of their sound, if I went for a walk in the old part of the town, the windows were open because it was warm, and I could hear noises, which really change extraordinarily this small town. So how would 40 people, including children, how would they keep their community in this very complicated community in which they find themselves? I was trying to understand it, and maybe I understand it a little bit, but I wanted to know if you thought of that, of groups in very small places.
Some of them here do come from equally small places, but particularly because the Alta Valle del Tevere, you have all these small villages in which you may have even 20. Most of the time, it depends where they're from. So you will have the kind of unity of migration because they're all coming from a similar place at the same place. So that's like very much, that chain migration in which one arrives and then the other one arrives and so forth. And now with the new laws on migration and so forth, really the one that can enter are usually because of family affiliations, and so forth. So at that moment, you create a really tight community coming from pretty much the same area. Of course, it may depend, by the time the children begin to grow up, they will have the Italians, whereas instead the other may not have it. They will only have the Arabic and they will have the Italian. Then you begin to see certain changes. But they often go back to Morocco, usually in August. They often celebrate weddings and everything that it is to their community. Ramadan is also a very important moment to get the community together. And there's an everyday situation. There's the language, there's the use. I mean, I never went to a home that didn't have mint tea. There's all of that continues, but it's depending also just because the way in which they can enter. We're really talking about community that often come from very close by. So it continues to thrive in that way. And eventually, there's, I know also like a bit Piacenza and all of that region, right? And which for me is very interesting because you do hear the Arabic spoken everywhere, even if it's 20, even if it's 40, that presence. And there's, for one thing, I would say that changes from one community probably to the other, but there's a difficulty of feeling that they're part of Italy. We have jus sanguis, we don't have jus solis. We have problems with citizenships, and so there's this. So they're coming from, they're dealing with same costumes and everything else. And also there's a way in which they have to maintain, because the problem is that if they lose themselves, then they become Italian. And that's never considered to be necessarily something good. So you have, so it's something that perhaps we may see changes in 20, 30 years, but not the rate we are going in Italy. So there's about that is quite interesting. If you have children, they often perhaps don't come and play with you and so forth. There's all sorts of things that are going on back and forth. Children in elementary, they might start going with other Italian children, but by the time they reach puberty, the girls will then go back more into the family and so forth. There's a constantly retention and opening. Also, as the laws and everything else changes in Italy, the political spectrum, which is not a particularly happy one right now, and they're afraid and they're scared, and so I don't know if I answered the.
Yeah, we have time.
I was just going to say from my perspective as a medievalist, it's been so fascinating that reading your book people can learn about these genres. So much of the time in historical sense, we study the genres through high art kind of treatises and things that are really from a completely different, much more urban cultural milieu. So I find I mean, you probably wouldn't use this word. I find it almost subversive, the way in which you have taken a cultural milieu that has so much sort of stigma attached to it in certain quarters, where that is not revered as an intellectual or as a cultivated or as an urban, clearly this is the opposite. This is the voice of the rural, which can teach us about the genres of song poetry. And that one could, using your book, learn, so much about the analysis and the really the sophistication and this whole tradition that people live by and that is so important to them. So for me, this is really an incredible gift that you're giving to people, that you're opening up something that, is new, and it's kind of a generosity, not only towards people who are misunderstood, but towards other readers, towards other scholars who are interested in learning more about poetry. I don't know if that's an incoherent, that's a kind of a medievalist view of, and just yesterday I chaired a session of the Religion and Writing Seminar where we were talking about the history of poetry, poetic criticism, and all of the different critical traditions that surround, Arabic poetry, Hebrew poetry, Romance poetry. And it's such a different approach. It's such a different window in or way into understanding this tradition. I think it's really like a huge turn that you have affected here. But I'm speaking as someone who doesn't know necessarily the literature.
That's not as I think you're being super modest, Susan. I think there has been so much attention and focus on Al-Andalus, particularly, and to everything that it was courtly, and to that which is in fact very important to the nation as well, because Moroccan nation does probably not want to be recognized with these voices. The year of Morocco in Paris in 1999, they were absent. So there is, but I mean, there is also a problematic of colonial practices for which, that which is ignorance, that which is primitive, and so forth. So you have this stress that is placed on that, which is quite different. At the same time, once you begin to read, perhaps keeping Al-Andalus and Al-Ala there, but once you begin to go into Qasida, into a larger idea of whatever, you actually begin to be quite closer to this. I have a former professor now, I like to call her colleague, Shahrazad Hassan, who said she understood all the Arabic and everything I said. And she's a scholar of Iraqi Maqam. So there's an Arabness that I think was Jeannie's point, that connects it. But because particularly as a medievalist and Al-Andalus, there's also a different register, quite very much so.
I just, there was a moment in the introduction, I think, where you spoke about, you cited Bakhtin, and when you're talking about a genre, and you were saying that some of the genres you're going to be studying incorporated other texts, and there are different pieces and parts, and I think that is very interesting. But I didn't see it sort of develop that much later on. But there were pieces, and if it was a song, it would refer to things, it would quote things, I guess. Yeah. And that's great. I mean, that's Bakhtin too. And Bakhtin is not far away from your interest, perhaps.
There is an incorporation indeed about all that is the vernacular. Proverbs play a huge role. Other vernacular speeches and so forth. There's because the poetry, it's, the little bit that I read, you don't have a linearity. You have these fragments, so which were called habbat, which is interesting because they're seed. So they have that possibility to migrate from one poem to the next. And of course, they also remain with that possibility to change it in a context of performance. So there's almost like this intertextual relationship, which is quite impressive, you know. And the musicians and the ones, I mean, Hafida Hasnawiya, the voice you've heard, recently passed away. And she was really an archive of knowledge of the verses. She will tell you that is from, she will tell you what that is from, which is quite difficult to do it, or maybe not a given. But then you have like the circulation of verses that they can be used. And in that sense, the intertextuality is tremendous. And so you go from Abidat Rama to Aida, which are kind of close. But then you can also go to women in Fez that they sung, or you can go into province, you can go. And you always have something, so they know it. And they, there's a moment in a book that, you know, I said, you know, I was in Rome, I'm walking around in Rome with someone, and somebody sends a text message. It doesn't send a text message saying, oh, welcome to Rome. You know, these are two Moroccans, you know, one would be in Morocco and the other one is in Rome at that moment. They cite a habbat, they cite a verse that refers to Rome. And there is immediately understanding not only of the verse, who's singing the verse, and the song where it's come from. So it's almost at times a coded language for those who know. Yeah.
We have time for a few more. Did you have a question back there?
Thank you. Yeah. I just wanted to ask if you encountered any incorporation of Italian or of Italian influence in the Moroccan Shabi.
No.
Okay.
Which is, but it's great. No,
It makes sense.
it's a wonderful question. But that sometimes what makes it, you know, even more in hip hop, you may find it, right? You may find it here and there in hip hop, but in Shabi, exactly, right? Yes, exactly. You know, there is an old song of the late Fatma bint Hussein, who will, however, they will use more the French. But at one point, there's a Fiat 126 is the model, and I was like, "What is she talking about?" I mean, I'm like I'm like, "Oh my God!" Then I went back, because the Fiat was very popular in Morocco at a certain point, so they must have gone from the Carouila to the 4x4, which is the Renault, and then eventually to the Fiat. I mean, and that's fantastic. But it's not that in the language that the young generation of Moroccan speaks, it's definitely evident. And the song itself, no, because also they themselves say, you know, for them, Italian words just what they always say is like, the words don't do it. So there's an intimacy in the language that has to remain that way. But hip hop, it's begin to be a little bit different as well. But the shabbiest think is shabby. It probably doesn't rhyme as well.
That's true.
Unless you can think of something that I would not know, and I would love to hear more.
I can't.
Any other questions?
First of all, thank you very much for this conference. It was really, really enjoyable. And I just wanted to ask, do you know if even before they migrated, those migrants had such a stronger appreciation for rural sounds and music rather than for urban sounds and music?
Absolutely. Because you know where you can tell, don't trust me on that, but go to a wedding in the region. That's what you will have. There is something, so I did more weddings than I will ever want to do for the rest of my life. And even when they're done, they will have maybe a moment in which they have the music shakia, you know, they'll have something else. But then, in which you will even have drums and org and all that. There is absolutely no problem. but there's a moment in which the tradition must come in. And that tradition only comes in for the ones who have attachment. So someone from Fez would not have those. But you get what I largely call Atlantic Plains and Plateau. And one of the reasons is because I think I'm always trying to say, look, this is a big part of Morocco. It's not a little part. You will know, the attachment is very strong, and it's always constantly reinserted or buttressed at every wedding. So even when they say, because of course they get sick and tired of me asking questions, right? And they're just like, yeah, whatever, what music you listen to, I listen to everything, which is sometimes it's open. And then you say, so you had a wedding, yeah, and I got married in Morocco. And what music did you play? Well, like Arshabi. That's when you know that it continues. Cassette tapes, the playlist. The playlist is it's unbelievable on a telephone or whatever that is. The playlist, even when it is the modern shabi, whatever we want to call it, contemporary, Daoud, Daudia, but it's always there. You will not find something else from. So to me, those are even someone I don't know if we can even call it second generation, because but let's say in their 20s, their playlist continues to be anchored in there, continues to be anchored in a number. And what is also happening is, thanks or not to YouTube, to everything else. So then they hear, let's call it a modern version of song, and then they go back and find the original one. So you have all of this constant exchange. But absolutely, they're very attached to it. I mean, that's what I learned it. I learned it in Morocco before I learned it in Italy, if you will. Thank you.